1900 Australian Commonwealth of Australia Act, again a British statute for a dominion of the English Empire. We have in fact borrowed extensively so far as part 13 of our constitution is concerned, the chapter which deals with trade, commerce and intercourse. We have also borrowed heavily from our own Government of India Act of 1935. But then what are the strides that the constitution has made? What is new? Equally, the directive principles chapter, which was something which was novel at the time, was also not something new. It was borrowed from the Constitution of Eyre, that is the Free Republic of Ireland, just a year before we got our independence, which was in 1946. Now, interestingly enough, part 3 of our constitution, which is the part which deals with fundamental rights, is the one thing that separates us from a different form of government, from say a monarchy or say a socialist government of the Soviet type. And that's why these rights are called fundamental. They are also inalienable. They really belong to you as a human being. And the struggle for them has been 800 years old. In fact, in the English-speaking world, it's interesting that today happens to be the 15th of June, because this is the 795th anniversary of Magna Carta. Exactly. Magna Carta was framed on the 15th of June 1215. And King John, who happened to be one of the Plantagenet kings of England, it's interesting also to know as a side note that from 1066 till today, England has been governed by foreigners, just as they were foreigners to us. So the Plantagenet dynasty to which King John belonged, which was a French dynasty, Norman dynasty, King John, because of arbitrary and despotic rule, was brought to big book by his barons. And the first real sort of flickering of the flame of liberty is found in that long document which we know as Magna Carta, which is the Great Charter. It took England a long while. In fact, to fast forward and go straight to 1688, which is when another Scottish dynasty was ruling, James II was the last Catholic king, was expelled in what they call their Glorious Revolution. And the result of the expulsion was a Bill of Rights of 1688. Now that Bill of Rights of 1688 said a couple of significant things. Apart from the liberty of the individual, it also basically laid down parliamentary rule for the first time. It said, for example, that standing armies could not be raised without parliamentary law. The king couldn't do it by himself. So, over 795 years, there have been the evolution of what ultimately landed up as our part 3, which we call fundamental rights. A large amount of part 3 is borrowed from the great Constitution of the United States, which, as you all know, is a document again of 200 odd years vintage, 1789. In fact, the same year as the storming of the Bastille in France. And our preamble, which speaks of, among other things, liberty, equality and fraternity, borrows these 3 expressions from the French Revolution. So, you have in our constitution a polyglot or compendium of a lot of laws that have been borrowed from the experiences of other countries. Now, so far as our part 3 is concerned, one of our constitutional advisors, one Mr. B.N. Rao, visited the United States and he was on one of the drafting committees. As you all know, our constitution is the result of a number of drafting committees. Now, Sri Rao happened to meet one of the conservative justices of the United States Supreme Court, Justice Frankfurter. And Justice Frankfurter told him that, look, I understand that you all are laying down a Bill of Rights in your Fundamental Rights chapter. Don't ever make the mistake of borrowing our due process clause. Because as you know, the due process clause of the 5th Amendment to the US Constitution was used substantively to knock down a number of laws, particularly in the early 1900s, the Lochner era as it's called there, dealing with minimum wages, etc., which were laws really for the betterment of those who were downtrodden, those who were weaker. So he told our B.N. Rao that, look, please don't adopt the due process clause, whatever you do, find some other way out. Now the other way out was to look at the Japanese constitution which had just come in. Again, like the Constitution of Ayar. It's a 1947 document. And that contained an Article 31, which is exactly where our Article 21 is copied from. So instead of having a full-blown due process so far as personal liberty is concerned, we had a colorless Article 21 to begin with, namely that you cannot be deprived of personal liberty or life except by procedure established by law. Now the law therefore could never be challenged. It is only the procedure that must be laid down by legislation, that's all. Now, interestingly enough, the Fifth Amendment speaks not only of life and liberty but also of property. All three concepts are put together in the US Constitution. We bifurcated them. And in fact, we did the opposite, I think, of what Justice Frankfurter intended. We had a full-blown due process so far as property was concerned. So on the one hand, you had Article 21, which was this colorless, lifeless article borrowed from the Japanese Constitution. And you had a full-blown due process in Article 19(1)(f), read with Article 31. It took us 27 years of constitutional interpretation by the Supreme Court and finally a constitutional amendment to right these matters. What happened on the property side was that very early you had land reform legislation which was absolutely basic for the then fledgling Congress party to put through. Now it put through various land reform acts. They were promptly challenged by Zamindars, and the Patna High Court in 1951 struck down the Bihar Land Reforms Act on the ground that it violated property rights. Two other high courts, Allahabad and Madhya Pradesh, did the opposite. And while the appeals were all pending, a First Amendment brought about some very drastic infractions into our fundamental rights. It added a new Article 31 capital A and a new Article 31 capital B. 31A basically said that, look, when we are putting through agrarian reforms legislation, any challenge on the ground that the equality principle is violated or that any of the 7 fundamental freedoms in 19 are violated must go out of the window without more. So 31A shielded agrarian reform legislation from attacks on the ground that the fundamental rights contained in 14 and 19 were violated. 31B went much, much further. Though it begins with the expression without prejudice to the generality of 31A, number one, it was not confined only to Articles 14, 19 and at that time 31. 31B was the entire fundamental rights chapter. Now, the whole fundamental rights chapter, and this is a matter which is very, very serious, in 1951 itself was put out of harm's way, so to speak, the moment there is a constitutional amendment putting into a new 9th schedule a particular statute. This is number one. Number two, and which was even more bothersome, was the fact that suppose the High Court or the Supreme Court had already struck down that act. 31B said that that act is resuscitated without more. In short, it drove a coach and four into the basic principle of separation of powers. Because it's well settled, as all of you know, as lawyers, that a legislation cannot directly interfere with a judgment of a court. It may change the basis retrospectively, but it can't turn around and say, sorry, I don't accept the judgment without more. And that is exactly what 31B set out to do. So the moment, therefore, some Land Reforms Act was put into the 9th schedule, two things happened. One, the entire fundamental rights chapter got blotted out. And second, even though that act may have been struck down by a court, without more, it was resuscitated. Now, very early in our constitutional history, in Shankari Prasad Singh's case in 1952, there was a challenge to this particular First Amendment, particularly 31A and 31B. Among the 5 grounds raised, 4 were procedural, which we are not directly concerned with. The substantive ground raised was that our Article 13 specifically sets out judicial review in the sense that the state cannot make any law which violates any fundamental right, and if it does so, that law is void. Now, the whole debate in Shankari Prasad's case was as to whether that law would include an amendment to the Constitution. Ultimately, 5 judges of the Constitution way back in 52 in their wisdom said, no, sorry, it would not. Article 13, when it speaks of law, speaks of ordinary law, not constitutional law. 31A and 31B, therefore, pass muster completely. Also, please don't forget that Bihar case, which led to 31A and 31B, also came up before the Supreme Court in the same year, State of Bihar versus Kameshwar Singh. Now, despite the fact that the Bihar Land Reforms Act by then, and it was entry 1 in the 9th schedule, was put into the 9th schedule and therefore screened from attack against all fundamental rights, the Supreme Court still struck down 2 sections, but this time struck them down on the ground that they were not legislatively competent, not that they violated a fundamental right. Nothing really happened for about 15 years. And after 15 years, we find that in Sajjan Singh's case, a bench of 7 had some doubts about this interpretation of Article 13 and therefore said, no, the full court must look into this again. The full court then convened of 11 learned judges at that point of time. And the celebrated Golaknath case was argued for days and days. On either side you had the entire galaxy from the bar. On one side you had M.K. Nambiar, you had Ashok Sen, Nani Palkhiwala, and on the other you had the then Attorney General, you had Niren Dey, Additional Solicitor General, you had Kanhaiya Mishra himself, a very great expert, Advocate General of UP, etc. And finally, by a razor-thin majority, 6-5, the Supreme Court said Article 13 includes constitutional amendments. So in short, the moment a constitutional amendment is made which infracts any fundamental right, down goes the amendment. Now this didn't augur well with the political powers that be at the time. And there were a massive influx now of various agrarian, again, reform legislations by various amendment acts, so that now the list swelled to something like 200 odd. And as a result, many articles which were at that point of time found to be constitutionally valid were now re-challenged. And again you had a full court reconvene in the celebrated case of Keshavananda Bharti, 13 this time. And this time the entire emphasis was not on the textual interpretation of Article 13, namely whether law includes constitutional or ordinary law, but on whether there is such a thing as a structure to the Constitution which you cannot violate. So the entire arguments now ranged around something different. The arguments now were, look, your preamble says this is a sovereign democratic republic. Can you, for example, amend the Constitution so as to turn it into something anti-democratic and let's say a monarchy or a dictatorship? The obvious answer would be no. Textually, of course, there were a lot of problems because constitutional amendments can be framed and passed in 3 different ways recognized by our Constitution. One is by ordinary law. For example, if Parliament wants to change the boundaries of a state or to introduce a new state, it may do so by simple majority. And Article 4 says this will not amount to an amendment for the purpose of 368. So simple law, a simple majority by Parliament will do for such laws. For the bulk, of course, of constitutional amendments, what was required was, and this again is a very strange requirement, the requirement for impeachment of the president was put on a much higher pedestal. I don't know why, frankly. I've done a lot of soul searching on this. I have not been able to come out with an answer. If today a president is to be impeached under Article 61, you must have 2/3 of the entire house, that is 540 Lok Sabha and 270 odd Rajya Sabha, 2/3 majority in both to impeach him. Otherwise the motion falls. However, for a constitutional amendment, all that you require is half the strength of the house. So half of 540 would be 270. My mathematics is not very good, but roughly in the region of 270. And so long as you have 2/3 of that 270, it's good enough. So the result was that in 60 years of our independence, we've had almost 100 amendments, almost 2 a year. It's a frightening figure. Look at it from the point of view of the older constitutions. The US constitution has been amended only 28 times in its 200 odd year existence. The Australian constitution only 6 times. This is its 110th year. But our constitution has had almost 100 amendments in 60 years. Please think. So it was so simple for most of the articles in the constitution to be amended by a mere 2/3 of half of the strength of both houses. Second thing, and this again is a very, very interesting thing. You had the third type of amendment, which is the amendment spoken of by 368. Now here, there are certain portions of the constitution which deal with states' rights. So all that you need in addition to that 2/3 and 2/3 of half is another half of the states ratifying, which is again a reasonably easy thing. Today there are about 28 states. So long as 14 states by simple majorities ratify constitutional amendments which may make inroads into 226, for example, it's good enough. So therefore, apparently we chose a path and we followed a path of amendment which really led us to radical changes being made all too easily. Now this really formed the background of the fundamental rights case, which is case Keshavananda Bharati. Therefore, fortunately for us, by a razor thin majority again of 7-6, you remember Golaknath was 6-5, now 7-6, Justice Khanna being the 7th man, 7 now laid down that there is such a thing as the basic structure of the constitution. This basic structure cannot be violated by a constitutional amendment, and hence we became the first nation in the world to strike down a constitutional amendment on a substantive as opposed to procedural ground. Now it's very fortunate that we did this as a matter of constitutional interpretation, because immediately after, close on the heels of the judgment of Keshavananda, which was delivered on 4th April 1973, Mrs. Gandhi slapped an emergency on the country. And together with the emergency came some very draconian constitutional amendments. Apart from populating the 9th schedule with a number of acts which have nothing to do with agrarian reform, including election acts with which she was directly concerned. Apart from all this, Mrs. Gandhi's constitutional amendments introduced various other very damaging things to the basic structure, 2 of which were left by the Janta government because they couldn't unfortunately muster the necessary 2/3 to do away with them. And these 2 articles were Article 31C as amended and 368 4 and 5. Let me pause here for a minute. I have already spoken and told you about 31A dealing with agrarian reform, 31B being open-ended so long as something is put into the 9th schedule, complete immunity from attack. Now 31C says, and really turns parts 3 and 4 on their heads. Whereas under part 3, a fundamental right, which is a basic right, is meant to be enforced in a court of law, and whereas under Article 37, a directive principle of state policy is not meant to be enforced in a law, it is merely something which the state must as a policy endeavor to, by legislation, achieve. 31C now says the opposite. 31C says the moment a law is framed and is relatable to any of the directive principles of state policy, straight away out go the fundamental rights contained in Articles 14, 19 and at that time 31. Now This therefore was fraught with the same dangers and difficulties as 31A and B. Fortunately for us, in 1980, in the first Minerva Mills case, the Supreme Court gathered the necessary courage to strike down this article. And it struck it down by saying that, look, 14 and 19 don't give us fanciful rights. They are in fact two sides of a golden triangle. That's how they put it. And if you take away 14 and 19, the third being 21, then the lifeblood of the fundamental rights chapter will be robbed, will be taken away. That's so far as 31C is concerned. 368, 4 and 5 basically tried to upturn Keshavananda Bharati by constitutional amendment, saying that no constitutional amendment can be challenged on any ground before any court of law. That was struck down fairly easily by all the judges by saying, sorry, there is no question of a doubt, because the article started with for removal of doubts. There is no doubt here. The law is laid down by Keshavananda Bharati. We are bound to follow it. So two important things were struck down. Now moving back, and I must take you now back to our personal liberty article 21. If you remember, 21 was the article which was lifeless, because so long as a law laid down some procedure, your liberty was forfeit. It took us 27 years to remedy this. It's only in Maneka Gandhi's case for the first time in 1978, 27 years later, that the remnants of the earlier Gopalan judgment were done away with, and ultimately we were told that even the law must be valid, fair, just, not arbitrary. And this was a result of reading one fundamental right into another. This doctrine of watertight fundamental rights was done away with. So if you read 14 into 21, the law itself now could be substantively challenged. In short, what Justice Frankfurter had told B.N. Rao at the very beginning of the Constitution was undone, so far as personal liberty is concerned. And the immediate aftermath of this was great, because from 78 till today, there have been, and I have counted, about 28 new rights which have been culled out substantively from Article 21, including the very important right of privacy, the right of persons who happen to be in jail, environmental rights, etc., etc. So we find that as a matter of constitutional interpretation, the Supreme Court did us very well in two spheres. One, so far as property legislation is concerned, kept curtailing it until, of course, the Janata Party did away with it altogether. So that today, the property the property right that is left is merely a husk. In fact, there are 2 or 3 areas now where property rights still obtain. 300 capital A is a neutral provision. Where it does obtain is, so far as minority institutions are concerned, there's a specific 1A added to Article 30, where if you take away a minority institution's property, you must see that you provide compensation so that it can rehabilitate itself. Equally, under 31A second proviso, if you take away from an agriculturist who's actually cultivating his land within the ceiling area, his property, then for that land also, you cannot give anything less than market value. But short of these 2 areas, and short of Article 26, which allows religious institutions to acquire, hold and dispose of property, the right to property has gone. So it took 27 years for our constitutional courts ultimately to whittle down the right of property and to give full bloom, so to speak, to the very, very important fundamental right of life and personal liberty. Now, with these 2 examples, we have come to a watershed, because I also want to give you the flip side of the picture. Where has the Supreme Court not ironed out the creases? Where, for example, did it get opportunities to do so and either fail to do so or create creases of its own? One area is the area, according to me, of appointment of judges. Now, you have 3 judges' cases, so to speak. You had S.P. Gupta, which was a bench of 7. Then you had The second judgment, which was the Supreme Court Advocates on Record case of 1993, which was of 9 judges, and finally Justice Bharucha's judgment, also of 9 judges, in the special reference of 1998. What they did in the later 2 judgments was to overrule the view of 7 judges in S.P. Gupta. And they said now that consultation with the Chief Justice, this being a constitution, and therefore we can we can interpret it so as to bring it in accord with the felt need of the times. And the felt need of the times is that it is high time that the executive be not the last word in appointment of judges, but that judges themselves, who are better equipped, should be the last word. So the interpretation or the interpretative process led to the word consultation as being a binding consultation on the executive. The word binding, of course, was missing. And you have so many examples in other articles of things like previous consent, etc., which are much stronger expressions. But still, the Supreme Court took the expression consult. The executive government must consult with the Chief Justice. Whatever the Chief Justice says is final and binding. So far, so good. However, it goes on to say that, look, High Court judges have legitimate expectations of coming up here. Now, we must take into account those legitimate expectations. And if we take them into account, then what we must also see is that short of outstanding merit, seniority must be given its due role. Now, in my very, very respectful submission, I think seniority has either no role to play or a very small role to play. The only role perhaps that it has to play is the role of experience. A senior judge will be more experienced than a junior judge. That's about all. Short of that, a litigant expects a far better quality of justice from the highest court, because don't forget, in the highest court what is ultimately laid down is final. There's nothing beyond that. As Justice D.A. Desai was wont to observe, there's nothing between me and God. This is it. You can't go beyond now. So, it is very important therefore that the personnel of the highest court be selected on merit, and the real consideration should be merit. Now, what is merit? Merit again therefore is an ambiguous expression. Justice Pathak, who was your second Chief Justice, I just saw your list of Chief Justice, very illustrious list of Chief Justices, had once told me that perhaps the best way of judging merit, and I think he was right, is to meet a complete cross-section of the bar of a particular court. If you were to meet advocates, like I was to meet all of you, and I was to ask the lot of you, not sections of you, as to who your best judge would be, I'm sure you'd be able to give me one name where the vast majority of you would concur. And that judge need not be the senior most judge. Now, if therefore there is some such mechanism which is put in to see that ultimately merit surfaces in the highest court, with due regard to region, of course, we can't have, let's say, half the court or 3/4 of the Supreme Court populated from Bombay judges or Madras judges or Calcutta judges. You must have due regard to region, but the best from that region. This Justice Bharucha did try to remedy in the third judge's case, but not, in my submission, effectively enough, because seniority still continues to play an important role. One other area which I find a problem area is the area of what is state action. Now, in the United States for a long time, though the judiciary was described by Alexander Hamilton in the famous Federalist Papers, number 78 to be precise, as the least dangerous branch of government. Why? Because it hath neither sword nor purse, it hath only judgment. Despite that, the US Supreme Court correctly held that the judiciary, as much as the executive and the legislature, were subject to fundamental rights. In our country, unfortunately, because of a 9-judge bench judgment in Mirajkar's case, the exact contrary was held. Now, before going into what Mirajkar really held, it was interesting to observe that the two protagonists in Mirajkar were none other than Mr. M.C. Setalvad, ex-Attorney General, and Mr. C.K. Daftari, the then Attorney General. Both were very different lawyers, though both were outstanding, absolutely outstanding lawyers. Setalvad was ramrod straight. There was no question of ever telling a court something which was even slightly out of the way. If there was something against him, he put it fair and square before the judges. So much so that after he retired, most advocates on record would first take an opinion from him. And if they found that the opinion was positive, only then would they give him a brief to argue. Because he was capable of telling a court, there's nothing in this matter. Mr. Daftari was a person of a very different character. He was brilliant as an advocate. In fact, his formula for success was a very interesting one. For every 1 hour's reading, do 2 hours thinking. And he had a tremendous sense of humor, which often got the better of judges he didn't like. One of them was a Justice Vyas, when he was Advocate General of Bombay. And somehow or the other, Daftari didn't like him. He was arguing something. And a particular book could not be brought in time, so Daftari handed the book over. Justice Vyas saw the book and exclaimed, "Mr. Daftari, there's a bug on this book." Pat came the answer, "Many a bug has crawled from the bar to the bench." Now he was that kind of advocate. He could think on his feet and he was brilliant. Another famous speech, that lecture that he gave, was on Republic Day. It's famous because it's called the Relic Day. He said, castigating Morarji Desai's government, which did nothing but follow our great Article 47, directive principle of prohibition, that look, I have cogitated long and hard, and I find there's something missing in our republic. What is that thing that is missing? Ah, the word pub. Now if you take away the word pub, what are you left with? A relic. So these were the two protagonists in Mirajkar's case, going back to Mirajkar's case. Daftari won, unfortunately for our constitutional law. And Mirajkar laid down as a matter of law. Only one judge dissented, Justice Hidayatullah. And the law therefore laid down was the judiciary and any judicial order that is made, howsoever arbitrary, howsoever discriminatory, howsoever violative even of the fundamental rights contained in 20 and 22, which are directed at the judiciary, would pass muster. Now, fortunately for us, one of the grounds of Mirajkar has gone. That one ground is a ground which harkens back to Gopalan, which has since been overruled, which is that you look at a particular effect, or you look at a particular law, or in this case an order, and see whether it directly or indirectly affects the fundamental right. Most of the judges came to the conclusion that on the facts of that case there was only an indirect infraction, therefore 19(1)(a) was okay, pass muster. And the facts there were that the Blitz editor, Mr. Mirajkar, comes to court and says, listen, there is a gag order by Justice Tarkunde, as he was at that time. The gag order is, this witness will be examined in camera. The result is, we cannot publish, the press cannot publish what that witness says. Now it's a very serious infraction of the core of 19(1)(a), so to speak. And despite that being so, most of the judges said, following Gopalan at that time, that no, sorry, there is no infraction. Today the test would be completely different, the reverse. What is the direct and immediate effect on the fundamental right? The direct and immediate effect on the fundamental right is gag. Therefore straight away 19(1)(a) attracted, and since you don't fall under the 7 exceptions under 19(2), out goes the order. So this part at least of Mirajkar goes out. So far as the second part of Mirajkar is concerned, again the majority came to a very peculiar conclusion. They said a writ of certiorari cannot issue to a superior court. Now the High Court is a superior court, therefore it can't issue. Justice Hidayatullah, in my opinion, correctly said in dissent that look, the High Court may be a superior court generally, but it is not a superior court qua the Supreme Court. And therefore writs of certiorari which issue downwards, he put it very picturesquely, but cannot issue either sideways or upwards, can certainly issue in exercise of its appellate jurisdiction downwards. Now, if that is so, it could surely issue in a writ equally under Article 32. So this is the second problem area so far as constitutional interpretation is concerned. I leave you now with only one thought. A lot has been said, there's a lot of judicial dicta on equality, on liberty, very little on fraternity. Now fraternity, which leads to the unity of the citizens of India, is a very, very cardinal and important concept. Unfortunately, that has not been explored. And I think one excellent area in which to explore it would be cases coming up under the new Article 21 capital A. Now 21 capital A, by an amendment made in 2002, converted a directive principle of state policy into a fundamental right. What it said was that, look, children between the ages of 6 and 14 now have a fundamental right to education. My wife happens to be an educationist, and I put to her that, look, I am in a position to write a book on comparative religion, and it is possible for me to devote my time to simplifying the basic tenets of both the Hindu and the Muslim faiths, basically, and various others, so that they can be taught in schools. And the cardinal value then of fraternity would not any longer be a teasing illusion, but would be something which would actually come to the citizens of our country, if not in these times, in future generations to come, regard being had to the vociferous tendencies we have today. Back came the answer from NCERT. No, we are a secular state. Now, if we are a secular state, hands off religion, you cannot teach religion at all. They forgot that the word secular was introduced only by the 42nd Amendment. And secular has to be read in the context of fraternity and unity. Now, how do I have fraternal feelings for somebody who I may call my brother without knowing what my brother is about? So I leave you with this one very, very important thought, and I wish that at some stage, either this High Court or the Supreme Court or some other court interprets 21 capital A in such a manner that this cardinal value of fraternity, which leads to the unity of the nation, which is so important,